Welcome to Symfony Workshop. I'm Gary Clarke, and this is the first in a small series in which I'm going to cover Symfony security and authentication. I decided to do this series because the security bundle is powerful and the documentation is thorough, but there are a lot of options, a ridiculous amount of options, so hopefully I'm going to save you some time and some head scratching by showing you how to do it visually. In this first one, I'm going to cover the concept of a user provider, something called an authenticator, firewalls, which is another name for the authentication system as a whole, and we'll start on a login form. Some information first. I record in high resolution, so don't watch on a blurry screen. Choose high definition if that works for you. Would you like to join a growing group of PHP developers and take your skills to a new level? If that sounds like you, all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon, and welcome. I shall start off by creating a new Symfony project, and I do that with Symfony New. And I'm going to call this Security Demo, so that will be the project name and the folder name. I'll move into that folder now, and I'm going to require my dependencies, my Composer dependencies. So, Composer require, and I'm going to need the security bundle. I'll need annotations, and I'm also going to need doctrine. So this will be doctrine ORM pack. All those will install super fast because I'm using Composer 2. I'm also going to need a dev dependency, which will be the web profiler, and that will help me for debugging inside the web browser. So that's installing. Let's now go over and check out the Composer JSON file, and I'll show you what I've installed. So here's Doctrine, so Doctrine Migrations Bundle and Doctrine ORM. Symfony Security Bundle, and here's my dev dependencies, which is a web profiler bundle that has its own dependencies, stopwatch and twig bundle. Next, I'm going to use gitignore.io to generate a gitignore file for me. So if you've not used this before, it's very good. You put in here what you're using in your project. So for example, I'm using Symfony, I'm using PHP Storm, and it'll generate a gitignore file which is relevant to those technologies, and I can just then copy this, go and paste it into my gitignore file, and it'll give me a nice starting point gitignore file, because the Symfony stuff's okay, but PHP Storm, it has this tendency to generate a load of files which, once they're in your project, it's very hard to get them out. It requires a lot of work, so if you tackle that up front, then it can save you quite a lot of aggravation later on. Now I'll make my first initial git commit, because those bundles will have added stuff to the project. If you see there, I've got the web profile YAML and annotations YAML. And what I will say is that I'll separate my repo into different branches, and each branch will represent a recording. So this recording I will call branch 1. Either branch 1 or recording 1, you get the gist. So there's one thing which I forgot to install, and that is the maker, which I'm going to need to create a user. So Composer require maker, and now what I'm going to do is create a user. This class will be what represents an authenticated user. I do it like this: Symfony console make user, name of the class user. Do you want to store user data in the database via doctrine? Yes. By doing it this way, it will generate a doctrine entity for me called user. This is the most common way of doing it, and I'm going to stick to the most common conventions. It also means I don't have to create a separate user provider class, which I would have to do if I wasn't using a doctrine entity for the user. This is referred to as an entity user provider. Next, I need to choose the property which is going to be used to identify the user, so I'll stick with email, which is the default. And finally, ask, does this application need to hash and check passwords? And the answer to that is yes. Let's go and check out the user entity. So much like any other entity, except it implements a user interface. This is that interface, and it represents the interface that all classes must implement. So there's a handful of methods in this interface which all user entities must include. So we'll go and have a look at the user entity, and I'll show you where those are in there. Some you will use, some you might use, some you won't use, I think, in our case. So get username, get roles, get password. Yep, get salt, we won't be using that because we'll be using sodium, and erase credentials. Maybe later on I'll see if we might use that for something. So let's have a look at the security.yaml file. This is where we'll configure all of our security and authentication. As you can see, we have 3 keys: encoders, providers and firewalls. I'll get to firewalls later, but for now, encoders. These are your password encoders. So we use the user class name for the name, and it says that it's going to auto select the best possible hashing algorithm. That's what algorithm auto does. So it will choose sodium when available. If that means nothing to you and you want to check it out, just Google libsodium. Providers, so we said our app user provider will be of type entity, and that we're going to use the app entity user class, and that the property that we're going to use to identify the user with will be the email property. Anyway, I think we're happy with our user entity, so we can go ahead and create a migration for that, and I do that with Symfony console make : migration. That's created, so we'll go over to the project and we'll check out that migration. I'll tidy it up a little bit. That should make it a bit easier for you to read, so fairly straightforward. The only thing which might stand out is this: the roles is a JSON type field. The roles field will be an array of roles which the user might have. As you can see, I've already gone ahead and created a database up front. I've called it security app, and now all I need to do is run that migration and create the schema. So I do that with Symfony console, then it's doctrine, migrations, migrate. And then it'll ask you if you're sure. The answer is yes. Let's go over to the database, give it a refresh, have a look at our table. So we've got a migrations table and we have our user table. What I'm going to need to do now is just insert a user, because we don't have a registration form yet. We'll create one of those later on in another lesson, but for now we just need to get a user into the system so that we can practice logging in. ID and email, I'm sure you'll find fairly straightforward. Roles, so this needs to be a JSON array, and as you can see here in the getRoles method in the user class, it says guarantee every user at least has role user. So one of the little quirks of Symfony security is that we have to guarantee that a user has at least this one role. This is a syntax for adding it to a JSON array. Then I need to take care of the password. So the password also needs to be hashed. How am I going to do that, you wonder? Well, the good news is that Symfony has thought of everything for us, and there's a little tool where we can actually encode a password using the console. Just copy my command and then you type in a password that you want to be encoded. It does the hard work for you, and then where it says encoded password, I just need to go and grab all of that. It starts with argon. Over to my DB admin tool, I'm using Table Plus, which I really like. Paste that in there, hit Command S, and there we go. It's inserted that into my database. I have my one record. Going back to the security YAML file, we have this firewalls key. This is probably the most important part, and this is your authentication system. This is where you tell Symfony how you would like to authenticate. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to do it using a login form, and we're going to create a special authenticator class. There's a quick way of creating everything we need here, and that is with Symfony console make : auth. If I select one, it will create a login form authenticator for us. I'll call that login form authenticator, though I can call it anything I want. I'm going to call the controller which handles this auth controller rather than the default security controller, and I will also generate a logout route. That creates 3 brand new files and it updates the security YAML file, so I'm not totally keen on generating so many or auto-generating so many new files, because I prefer to have a bit more control things myself. But what I'm going to do is the login form authenticator. I'm going to keep some of it but mainly customize it all myself. That extends this class, which is the abstract form login authenticator. I intend to keep the properties and I'm going to keep the constructor, but the rest of it, all the methods, I'm going to delete and I'm going to redo from scratch myself. And I think that way is the best way to give you a good understanding of how this stuff works. As you can see, I've now got a red angry squiggly line because there's certain methods which I'm meant to implement. 5 from the authenticator interface and 1 from the abstract form login authenticator. So that's the class that we're extending. Let's follow the path and we can see how we've reached to all these things. So abstract form login authenticator extends abstract guard authenticator, which implements authenticator interface, and that's what we're looking at now. And we'll need to add all of these methods to our class if they're not already added to one of the other classes which we are extending. This authenticator class will be called into action before the request actually hits the controller, and the methods will be called in a sequence a specified sequence. Let's go and have a look at security YAML and see what changes have happened there before I show you the login form. So here you can see there's a logout path which has been specified, and also if you look we have a key called guard which takes an array of authenticators, and we just have the one login form authenticator. Our other two files are the auth controller and the login form. So this is the auth controller. We've created two routes and therefore we have two methods. One is login with the name of app login. I think we'll just concern ourselves with login at the moment and we'll deal with logout after. We also have a login.html.twig file, which is basically just a plain login form. I'll take you and show you that now. It has two fields, email and password, and then a submit button, and also a hidden CSRF token field. We don't need to worry about the value of that because, as you can see, Symfony is handling that for us. Let's now start up a server and we'll go over and have a quick look at the login form. We won't actually be able to submit it yet because we've not put any of the authenticator logic in place, but at least we'll be able to have a look and see what we're dealing with. So I've started Symfony's inbuilt server. I'll grab this URL, I'll append on login to that, because that is what the route is. As you can see, a fairly plain looking login form. This little bit in the profiler here where you have a little icon of a person gives you information regarding authentication. This tells us that we've authenticated anonymously using an anonymous token and that we're using the main firewall. You might be wondering, what does that mean? Let's go back to the security YAML file and I'll show you what I mean with this anonymous login. So as you can see there, anonymous true, it means that you can visit certain routes without actually needing to have logged in. You're visiting the login form anonymously because obviously you won't be an authenticated user if you still need to log in. I'm going to take a pause there. Hopefully you're following along and you're learning stuff. Still plenty more to come. We need to style this form. We'll probably add things like remember me's. We're going to do registration forms, and obviously we're going to fill out our authenticator, and I'll show you the path from start to finish, how it authenticates a user. Before we get into things, I'm going to make this form look a bit better. So over to Bootstrap in the forms section, and I can grab the first form that I come to because this contains an email field and a password field. I'll paste that into there. I'm going to take the liberty of behind the scenes merging my two forms so that my original form is styled with a new styling. As you can see, not quite there yet. We need to grab something else. So over to Bootstrap again, grab the CSS. And I'm just going to paste this into templates base html.twig. There's a block for style sheets here, so I'm just going to paste that in there, and I'm also going to create a div with a class of container in which I wrap the body. For the form, I'm just going to add 50 pixels of top margin, and that's it for the CSS, thankfully. So I'll give that a refresh. That looks a bit better, more professional. If that went a bit fast for you, just go back and pause it on each form. Also, of course, I'll leave a link to the repo down below where you can go and grab the files if you want to do that. Let's go back to login form authenticator, and the first method we come across is supports. Basically what this does is it makes a decision, should this authenticator be used for the request. And how do we know that we need login form authenticator? Well, we'll be on a login page and we'll be trying to log in. And the way we'll be doing that will be by sending a post request so we can check those exact things. So I'll check that self login route matches request attributes get underscore route, and I'm going to check that the request method is post. So request is method post. Let me now explain the sequence to you. So these next four methods are all called in sequence. I'll try and find a happy balance between not going into too much technical detail but giving you enough to understand it. So first off, get credentials. These are the credentials that we're going to use to try and authenticate a user. So in our case, we're passing a login form which contains an email field and a password field, and so we'll be using those. The credentials that we return from that method then get passed in to the get user method. This is where we'll take the email address and we'll try and locate a user in the database using that email address. If a user is found, we return that user, and that user gets passed into the next method, which is check credentials, along with the credentials, and we check that the password is a match for that particular user. That returns a boolean. If it returns true, then we move on to on authentication success, and this is basically where we decide what we want to do once we have authenticated. Where do we want to redirect the user? So I'll start out with get credentials. I'll open up an associative array. So this will be the values from our login form, which will be mapped to keys. And I can call the keys what I want, but I'll stick to the same names as the login form or very similar names. So let's go and have a look at that form now. On the email field, we've called that email, and the password field, we'll call it password. And there's also the CSRF field. So we'll stick with those, I think. Email, request and then get, and then the key email. I'll do the same thing for password and CSRF token. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to set a key on the session for the last username. So that is done with request get session set, and then I can use the constant last username on the security class, and then for that I'm going to use the credentials email key. Now, like I said, the credentials which are returned from there get passed into the getUser method. Just to prove that, I'll dump this out and we'll go and take a look at that in the browser. So submit the form, and there we go, email, password, CSRF token. What we need to do with this method is look for a user in the database which has a matching email address. If we find one, we're going to return that user. If not, we need to throw an exception. Now, I'm using PHP 8, so this gives me a chance to use one of the new features. We can now throw exceptions from an expression. So I'm going to try and assign the value to this user variable. If no value is set, then I'm going to throw a new username not found exception. So as long as you're not on PHP 10 by the time you're watching this, hopefully that gets me a bit of street cred. If you want to know more about some of the new features in PHP 8, then check out my 8 things you'll love about PHP 8 recording. This user gets returned, and it's what gets passed in here. So the user interface type int, if you recall when we created our user entity, it implemented the user interface. Just before I do my credentials check, I'm going to add a doc block for the getUser method, and then we'll work on the check credentials. So first off, I'm going to check the CSRF token. Now, when I auto-generated this file using the makeauth command from the console, this code that I'm putting here was actually placed in the getUser method, but I prefer to put it in the check credentials method. It just makes more sense to me, because I leave the getUser method just for only getting the user. Maybe the reason for it being in getUser is that if you check for CSRF token and it's invalid, then there's probably no point getting a user from the database. But I'm going to leave mine here. The way that I check if it's valid is I use this. If the CSRF token manager is not a valid token, then I need to throw an exception, and there's actually a custom exception for this. So we can throw a new invalid CSRF token exception. Now what we need to do is check if the password is valid for this particular user, and the way we do that is this password encoder is password valid. The first argument is the user, and the second argument is the field which you want to check, which is the password field. If you have the same config as me and you follow the trace back far enough, you'll end up here. Symfony component security core encoder sodium password encoder. And this is a method which does the checking of the password. It looks at the raw password which was entered in the login form. It looks at the encoded password in the database, and then having checked that the password isn't empty and that it meets the correct length, it then uses this method to check one against the other. Sodium crypto PW hash string verify. It's saying is encoded an encoded version of raw, and it will return a boolean, true or false, and then it will also return that true or false from check credentials. If it's false, then we don't take this any further, we have invalid credentials. If it's true, we move on to the next part of the puzzle, which is on authentication success. And like I said previously, this is where we decide what we want to do with the user once they've authenticated, because you won't want to send them back to the login page. You're probably going to want to send them somewhere else, and this might need to be customized because they might have been trying to enter a previous route and you want to send them back there, or they might have certain roles and permissions and you want to send someone with certain roles to one page. If they have another role, they might want to be sent to another page. For example, when you log in an admin, you might want to send them to an admin page. I'm going to look at some of the more complex scenarios later, but for now I'm just going to redirect to the home page. Let's have a look at the arguments so we can see a token and a provider key. The provider key is straightforward. It's the key for our firewall, which we called main. For the token, we'll dump that out and we'll have a look at it. So we have a post authentication guard token. The way I like to think about this is like a pass. So if you go to a concert and you see people with passes hanging around their necks, it might say who they are, might say what roles they have, for example, security, hospitality or whatever, and authenticated true, you could equate that to the same as saying backstage, yes. So basically, who are you? What do you do? Where are you allowed to go? In order to redirect a user to a home page, we're going to need some setup. So I've created an app controller and I'll just have one method in here which renders a home page. So I'm extending the abstract controller and then I'm just going to create an index method. And from there, I just need to render a home page. So return this render and I'll put it in an app folder within templates. And I'll just call it index.html.twig. And so if you want to access an authenticated user in a controller, this is how you do it. We don't actually need to do it because we can do it using Twig. But this getUser method returns a user interface. Let's dive into that method and see what we're talking about here. So we look into the container, into token storage. We see if we have a token and we look for a user on that token. Like I say though, we're going to be able to access the user using Twig, but it's handy for you to know this if you didn't already know it. Let's add some routing. The route will be simply /homepage, and I'm going to give it a name of app_homepage, and that will come into play when we use the URL generator in order to redirect there. As you can see, I'm also using named arguments, so name, colon, and then app homepage as a string. Let's create that Twig file also. So inside of templates, I create a file which is in the app folder, and I'm going to call it index.html.twig. I'll start by including base.html.twig. As you'll see, I've got a bit of auto-completion there because I'm using the Symfony plugin for PHP Storm. I won't tell you what software to use, but what I will say, it's really helpful for stuff like this. And we'll have a customized welcome message. So I'll say welcome, comma, and then I can access the user using app.user and then dot and then username, which in our case will fetch the email address. Now let's add that redirection that we talked about. So the way I do this is return new redirect response. Redirect response comes from Symfony component HTTP foundation. I need to pass in a URL to redirect to. The way I can do this is with URL generator. So this URL generator generate, I can pass the name for our route, which was app homepage. If you want to know more about routing and named routing, check out my routing tutorials. Let's give this a try, and there we go. Welcome, Gary@example.com. So that's worked. As you can see in the profiler, we now have a user, Gary@example.com. We're using the post authentication guard token, and it's even provided us a little link which we can click on to log that user out. Now, say that hadn't worked, then we would have needed to redirect to a login page, and the way we do that is in the get login URL. We just provide a URL again. Let's test this out. So I'll go over to login and I'll put in a fake password, redirects me back to login page, and we have this error message, invalid credentials. How about if I used a false email address? Let's give that a try. And it says username could not be found. But if we look at the exception we created, that's not the actual message that I passed in. So let's investigate this. Over to login html.twig, and as you can see, it's retrieving a message key off of the error. Let's go and look at the username not found exception. And here we have a method get message key, and there's the error message which is being displayed. Whilst we're in the get user method, here's something interesting. A lot of this code is actually redundant because if we return null, then by default a username not found exception will be thrown. So I can simply return this. And if no user is found, null will be returned and the user not found exception will be thrown. Let's give this a try. And there you go, username could not be found. So sadly my shiny new PHP 8 code has to go. I'm going to start this one by quickly explaining a bit of the magic behind a couple of things I've already covered. So First off, I'll explain how the last username gets retained in the username field or the email field as we're using when we enter our credentials. So I'll enter a false password, but as you can see, the email address which I used has been retained. If we look at the email field in login.html.twig, that's this value here. So we're setting a value to this last username. The value actually gets set here in the getCredentials method of login form authenticator. If we look at our auth controller, this is where we pass the value into our Twig template. So it comes from this authentication utils. Let's go and have a look. As you can see here, get last username. So it looks in request attributes to see if there's a key for security last username. If not, then it looks in the session for the same key. And so just to demonstrate this, I'm going to hard code in the value Mickey Mouse and send this to the template instead. Back over to the browser. Once more, I shall enter the wrong password, hit submit, and I'm now Mickey Mouse. So hopefully that was clear. Just staying in the same file, let's check out this logout method. So as you can see, it says the method can be blank because it will be intercepted by the logout key on your firewall. It's actually just the routing that we need. So let's log in. Okay, here we are on the home page, and now if we go to the logout route, there you go. So we end up here. If we check at the bottom though in the profiler toolbar, as you can see, authenticated no. So we have been logged out. In security.yaml, this is a logout key which we mentioned, and as you can see, it maps to this logout route here. What we want to do is redirect to a better location once we are logged out. Sensible default will be to redirect to the login page. So let's do that. You'll need to add a target key, and then the value for that should be the name of your login route, which in our case is app_login. Let's go and give this another try. So I'll log in. You might get this first time you try it. If you do, just do it again and that'll go away. So here we are on the home page. Now let's go to the logout route, and we're redirected to the login page. Perfect. Let's have a quick look at the CSRF token. So we have this hidden field in our login page, and then we're generating this CSRF token here. In the check credentials method, we new up the CSRF token, and if you look at the ID, it's the same as what we are passing here. So if I was to change this to fake and then try to log in, then I'm getting invalid CSRF token. So this needs to match what you're checking against. Change it back. Let's go and give this another go, and we're logged back in. Let's now take a look at Remember Me. Symfony's done half the work for you on this, so I'll paste in the old code for the Remember Me box. The most important thing here is the name, which should be _remember_me. Then over to security.yaml. We need a Remember Me key underneath our firewall. So Remember Me : and then we can add some values if we want. Symfony will actually give it a default name, but I'm just going to make one up in order to make this easier to demonstrate. Then secret. This is a parameter which I'm using, and the value that I'm using actually comes from our .env file for app secret. And so this is how we insert parameters into our files. We use %, then parameter name. Lifetime, there's also a default, but I've made mine up as a week in seconds. So there's my new Remember Me box. I'll fill in my credentials and also check that. The way this works is that it places a cookie in your browser. So even when the session has expired, the cookie will be read and you'll be authenticated using that. Let's have a look at DevTools. So across the top, we're looking for the application tab. Across the left, cookies. And here is our cookie. So name, security demo, which is what we gave it, the value. And if we look at the expires max age, that looks like it's a week from today. So I'm going to take Google's word for it on that. Let me now show you a problem that we currently have with this application. So I'm going to log out, and I'm going to go and try and visit the home page. So home page. So it's tried to get us there, but we're logged out. The reason why we're getting this error is because it's still trying to access username of a user, and we don't have a user because we're not authenticated. When I refresh, we're on the home page, but we're authenticated anonymously, and I don't want anonymous users to be able to visit that page. I want only logged in users to be able to visit that page. The way we can control that is with this access control. And like it says in the comments, it's an easy way to control access for large sections of your site. And Symfony makes this very easy because if you recall the user entity in the getRoles method, we specified that the user would always have at least that one role of role user. And the way this works is it just uses regular expressions to match paths. So what I'm going to say here is that unless the path is login, the user must have role user. This way it means that our entire application requires a authenticator user except for the login page. So I'm going to try my luck at visiting the home page again, and that redirects me to the login page. So let me log in, and this time I'm allowed to visit the home page, no problem. For this last bit, let's see if we can improve the user experience a little bit. So at the moment we only redirect to the home page once a user logs in, but what if they'd been trying to get to somewhere else before they were told they needed to authenticate? They might log in, they might not want to go back to the home page, they might want to go back to that page, and they also might not know how to get there. So let's help the user out a bit. And we left the comment here, try to redirect the user to their original intended path. So over to App Controller, and I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to add a new endpoint, and I'll paste that in there. So I'll give it a name of alternate page. For the route, we'll go to not the home page, give it a name of alternate page, and I'm going to need to create a file called alternate page html.twig. So over in templates, I'll copy what I've got, paste that in there, change that to alternate page, and then what we'll do, we'll just keep this very simple and we'll just put a big bold heading which lets us know that we're actually on an alternate page and not the home page. So let me go and try and visit that page, not the home page. As you can see, I've been redirected to login. In that case, I shall log in and we'll see what happens here. And as you can see, I'm redirected to the home page as per usual. So the way that we make this work is if we scroll up to the top of our login form authenticator, you'll see this target path trait. Now take a look at this save target path. You shouldn't need to call this yourself, but what happens is this will get called for you, and the last URI you've tried to visit will get saved in the session under this target path key. What we're interested in is this get target path, because this is where we retrieve that value. So that's what we're going to do now. I'll try and save that value to a target path variable. If I'm able to do that, I'll then redirect to that path. So the way I can do this is by target path equals this get target path, and the first argument should be the session, which I can get from request get session. The second argument should be the name of your firewall, and that is actually what comes from this provider key, which is passed into on authentication success. Now what I need to do is just redirect to that target path. So I'll copy this and I'm just going to replace this path here with the target path variable, and that should be good. I'll just throw a comment in here to make all of this clear what's going on, and then we'll go over to the browser and give this a go. So I'm going to make sure I'm logged out. First thing I'm going to do is try to go to not the home page. As you can see, it's redirecting me to login. Let me log in, and then it takes me to not the home page. So that's spot on. Users are happy. Everything's good in the world. For this one, there's going to be quite a lot of code involved because we need to register and authenticate user. We need to create the record in the database. We need a registration form. We're going to send an email with a link for the user to confirm registration. This needs to be security protected and time protected, and there's a few other considerations also. If I created a video for you to code along as I did all that stuff, it will be well over an hour long, and very few people would probably watch it on YouTube. But luckily Symfony has our backs, and we can generate most of the code we need with a couple of commands. Then we can customize that code to our needs. So let's do that, and I'll explain the code as we work through it. First thing I'm going to do is require the Symfony form component. So composer require Symfony/form. So that will install lightning fast because I'm using Composer 2. And then what I do is I run a command to generate a registration form, and that is Symfony console make:registration-form. As you can see, that's failed because before we do that, we need to compose a require validator, because a lot of the validation is going to be done for us out of the box. In fact, all of it's going to be done for us out of the box. With that installed, let's try again, and it'll ask you a series of questions. Question 1, do you want to add a unique entity validation annotation on your user class? I'll go with yes. Then, do you want to send an email to verify the user's email address after registration? I'm also going to go with yes for this, just an extra bit of security, and having selected yes, it lets me know that I'll need to install another component. Next question, would you like to include a user ID in the verification link? So I'm going to stick with the default no, which means that this registered user would have to be signed in when they click the confirmation link. Next question, what email address will be used to send registration confirmations? So we can put anything here, but I'll go with admin@securitydemo.com. Hit enter, and what name should be associated with that email address, and we'll just say security. Do you want to automatically authenticate after registration? And I've just hit yes for that. I'll need to install the couple of things that I was notified of, so I need mailer and I need the verify email bundle. Now I'm going to take a look and see what's been installed. So I did a git commit before I installed all that stuff, so I can just do git status, and we'll ignore the top 3 for now. We've got registration controller, we've got this form folder because we've now got the form component, email verifier, and also in templates we have this registration folder which will contain a couple of files, a registration form and an email confirmation. Let's have a quick high-level look at our registration controller. So we've got 2 methods. One is register, and it's for a route with the name of app register, and obviously that's for registering the users. And the other route that we have is verify email, and that is for when you click on the link in the registration verification email. I've tidied up the params for the register method, and one by one from the top they are requests, so that's the HTTP request, user password encoder interface, so we're going to use the user password encoder to encode the password which gets sent from the registration form. Guard authentication handler or guard authenticator handler, we'll use that to log the user in once they've registered, and of course we're going to need our authenticator in order to do that, which is our login form authenticator that we've worked on in the last 3 videos. Let me walk you through the flow or the sequence of events. So the first thing we do in all scenarios is we create a new user object. And so if you haven't seen how the Symfony form component works, check out my form video. I'll leave a link at the top. We create a form which is linked to an entity or an object, and the fields on that form map to properties on that object. And we use a form type class, so in our case a registration form type class, to decide which fields we want to show and what mappings we want to have. Anyway, we have 2 logic paths here, one for submitting the form, which is what we're looking at now, and there's also one for displaying the form. So here we're first going to check, is the form submitted and is the form valid, and the validation constraints, we add them to the registration form type. Next, we're going to set the user password, so it will be submitted in plain text by the form. Then we encode it here and we set it on the user entity. Then all we need to do with the user is just persist and flush. This is the code for sending the registration confirmation email. I'm going to comment that out for now because that's a subject in itself. I just want to solve one problem at once. This last method here is just for logging the user in once successful registration. So that is the form submitted logic path. This is the other logic path. We just want to display a form on first visit if no form's been submitted. Okay, so seeing as I'm not going to send the email for now, I'm just going to comment out these lines of code in mailer.yaml because I don't want to throw errors. I've not set up mailer yet and I'm not actually sending mail just yet. Now let's go over to the registration form type. So this is where we build our form using PHP. So I'm in source form registration form type. And in this build form method, I'm injecting the form builder interface, which means that the container will give me a form builder object. And then off of that builder, I can chain these add methods, and these will become the fields on my form. So the first one is email, fairly straightforward. That maps straight to my user object. The next one, agreed terms. As you can see, it says it's a checkbox type, and also if you look at this, it says mapped is false, which means it doesn't map to a field on the user object. In fact, it's just a form field with this validation constraint attached to it, and this constraint is true. So in this case, it means a checkbox has to be checked, and if not, validation fails. If it is checked, then validation passes, and that's all that that field does. The next one is plain password. So as you can see here, mapped is false. So this isn't mapped to the password field on the user. This is just a plain password field on the form, and then the plain password field will get sent and encoded and then added to the user. And so a couple of constraints: mustn't be blank and it must meet a minimum length. So this is what I was talking about there. As you can see, the password gets encoded and then it gets set on the user. I'm just going to tidy up this register method by collapsing out the commented out code, and I think what we'll do is we'll go and actually have a look at that form that we've just been creating with our form builder. So this is it. If you're unfamiliar with the syntax, check out my form component recording, but you should be able to pick out what's going on here. We have form start and form end functions, and the registration form gets passed into that, and then we have a form row for each of the fields which we added. And at the bottom here we have a submit button, which I'm just going to leave a bit of styling so it looks a bit more like a button. Next, what I'm going to do is take a look at the user entity. So we've added a new field, is verified. This defaults to false, and basically until you click on the link in the registration verification email, the user will be unverified. Once you click that link, then this should be reset to true. Because we've got this new field, it means we need to create a new migration to do the alter statement on the table. So Symfony console doctrine migrations diff. That should create us a is verified field, which should be of Boolean type. Alter table user add is verified Boolean. Now you will probably have users already in your database if you've been following along, in which case this would throw an error, but we can overcome that by adding a default and giving it a default of false, which means that those existing records will now have a default value of false. Doctrine migrations migrate, that runs the migration, and if I look at my existing users now, as you can see, is verified is set to false on that. Let's go and check out the register form. What do you suppose is going to happen when I try and visit this? I'm redirected to login. And there's a very good reason for that. If you remember, in our security YAML file, we set it so that any other route than login requires me to be logged in. So I need to also append register onto this, and then hopefully I should be able to visit register. And here we are at our register form. Not very pretty. I might tidy this up later. Okay, a quick word on what we expect to happen once registered. So once registered, it's going to authenticate me using my login form authenticator, and if we remember, that will then redirect me to the home page. So that's one thing we need to look out for. I'm going to truncate my user table so there's no records in there, because the record I had in there I'd entered manually. So when I try and add another by registering, I'll probably get an error with my Postgres sequence. Let's try registering now. And so email, password, agreed terms, register, and as you can see, we are redirected to the home page. When I refresh the database, this is what I get. So as you can see, my ID for this record is at 9 because I've been having a little practice behind the scenes. But if you note, the is verified Boolean is set to false, and that's what we're going to take care of next. The is verified Boolean defaults to false, and it only gets converted to true once a link is clicked in the registration confirmation email. In order to be able to click that link, we first need to be able to send the email, and that's what this code does here. So this send email confirmation method on the email verifier class is quite clever, and it's responsible for creating a signature which is made up of different components. This gets written into the link which is part of the email. And so this is the link here, and as you can see, we have this signed URL. And so inside that signed URL, it'll comprise of an expiry timestamp and a signature, which is used to check the user's credentials. In order to send emails, I'm going to need to set up a mail server. I'm going to cheat a bit because this is a registration lesson and not one on sending mail. So I'm going to use Docker, and I'm going to use a mail catcher which will simulate having a mail server running. So as you can see, I've got a Docker Compose file which sits in my project root, and I've been using this for my database. You use whatever you want for your database. And so I'm going to add another key underneath services, which will be mailer. I'll just convert that to lowercase. So I'm going to need an image, and I'm going to use something called Schickling Mail Catcher. So you can find this on the Docker Compose hub if you want to look for there, but that's how you spell it: Schickling /mail catcher, and then ports. I'm just going to pass an array which will be 1025 and 1080. Once I've done that, there'll be a couple of steps to complete. So I've currently got Docker Compose running, so I'm going to run Docker Compose down, and then I'm just going to run it back up again. So Docker Compose up, and then -d, which will run it in the background. And as you can see there, creating security demo mailer. So that's my mailer service. And in order to run my webmail, I can use Symfony open.local.webmail. And then that opens this. Here's my mail catcher. If you've ever used anything like Mailtrap, it's similar to that. It's a fake mail server. So I'm going to log out, and then I'm going to go back to the register page, and we'll give this a try. So register a different user this time, another user at example.com. Enter a password. Need to agree terms, and then register. And so here we are on the home page. It's logged us in over to the mail catcher, and as you can see, we have a mail, and this is exactly what we're looking for. Hi, please confirm your email. And there you can see the confirm my email link, which is the all important component. Let's take a look at all the individual pieces of that link one by one. And so first off, we have the path, which is verify email. I'll show you that in the controller in a second. Then we have expires, so this will expire in an hour, and that is a little security measure. We have the unique signature, like we mentioned, and then we also have the token, which is used to match against tokenized credentials. Over in the controller, as you can see, the path matches, verify email. This next line, deny access unless granted. So if you remember when we went through the process in the console of setting this up, we said then that we wanted the user to be authenticated when we confirmed using the confirmation email link. So I prefer to, that way it seems a little bit more secure. This next method, this is really where all the work takes place, handle email confirmation. It's actually the method inside of that, validate email confirmation. So first off, we check and see if the signed URL is a valid signature. Then we check that the timestamp is still in date. What we do then is we create a token with a user ID and user email. We grab the token from the signed URL, and what we want to do with that is, using the hash equals function, we just check the two tokens against each other. If they're not a match, an exception is thrown and this fails, and that's how it works really. It doesn't return anything, this method. What it does is it just tries to throw exceptions, and if an exception is thrown anywhere, end of process. If it goes through, then it's all good news. If it fails, we catch a verify email exception. We set a error message on the session and redirect to the register page. If successful, I think I'll change this so it redirects to the home page, and that will be with a success key in my flash messages. And thinking about that, seeing as we have it, we might as well use it. So this success message here, what we're going to do is we'll put it on our home page. I'm going to borrow from the register.html.twig file, because here it has a error message in the flashes. So over to index.html.twig, which is inside the templates app folder. I'll paste that in. Instead of calling it flash error, we'll actually call this flash success. So we'll change that, and we're looking in app flashes for a success key. We'll change the styling to alert success, and obviously the message needs to be flash success. And then with that, I think we just need to go and click the link and see how we get on. Confirm my email, and there you go, redirected to the home page, and we have the success message. Your email address has been verified, which is the exact same message that we set on the flashes here. Okay, so hope that was all understandable for you. Let's go over to the database and check this out. And as you can see, the is verified boolean has now changed to true. Okay, now password resets does involve a lot of code. So we're going to do what we did in the register form recording, and we're going to pull in a package which is going to take care of most of this for us. Do what I do. You need to compose or require Symfony casts reset password bundle. Once that's installed, we'll just need to run a command, and that will take us through a series of questions. So very similar to like we did with the register form. That command is Symfony console make : reset password. Okay, question 1. What route should users be redirected to after their password has been successfully reset? Now it's suggesting app home, but if we look at our app controller, we actually called it app home page. So I'll paste that in there, hit enter. Now it says what email address will be used to send reset confirmations. So we'll use the same one that we used in the registration thing, and we called it admin@security-demo.com. Paste that in there. What name should be associated with that email address? And that name is security. And that completes that process for us. It's created us some new files. The first one I'm going to look at is reset password request, which is an entity inside app entity, and it implements reset password request interface. As you can see, it has a couple of properties, ID and user, so it has to relate to a user obviously, and then it includes a trait called password reset request trait. The main things to look at here are these dates, requested at and expires at. And you'll see there of date time immutable. The important thing with these dates is that the user will only be given a certain time frame in which to change their password once they make the request. Let's go ahead now and create a migration file for our reset password request. So the way this works is that a user will make a password reset request that will create a reset password request record in the table, and then once that request is completed, i.e. the user enters their new password and it is all verified, then the password reset request or the reset password request record will then be removed from the database. My migration file all looks good, so let's migrate the database. Symfony console doctrine : migrations : migrate. It'll ask you if you're sure, just click yes or just press Y. And let's look at that table now. So ID, user ID selector, hash token, requested at and expires at. I now want to add a link on my login page for the user to click if they have forgot their password, and that will redirect them then to the page where they can fill in a new password. You'll see that there is a reset password controller, so we'll come back to that shortly, but I've just grabbed the name of the route that we need there, and I'll borrow a bit of HTML from here, paste that in, and I'm just going to customize this to my needs. So the path is the one which I've just copied from the reset password controller, and that is app forgot password request. And I'm just going to ask the user forgot password. With that in place, let's go and give this a test drive. So I'll enter an email address. I'll not even bother with the password. I'm just going to click straight on forgot password, I think. As you can see, it's sent me straight back to the login page. So the reason for that, if you recall our security YAML file, unless you're logged in, you can only visit login and register. I'm going to add one more route to this. I know it's getting lengthy and this isn't really going to scale much longer, but we're going to concentrate on authorization in the next recordings, so for now we'll not get sidetracked. If you can live with this for now, then so can I. Let's go back and give this another go. Forgot password, and here we are. So we're now at the reset password page. Fantastic. Let's have a look at the reset password controller. And this is the route that we're looking at. What it will do is ask if a valid form has been submitted, which in our case it hasn't. And so the other option is it will then render the form, which is the form that we see here, request.html.twig. Let's go and have a look at that. Some of this syntax should be familiar to you by now. we've created a form type called a request form type, and it just has an email field where we want to send an email to reset passwords. I'm going to set my mail catcher running, which is a fake mail server, and I can do that with Symfony open : local : webmail. And so this is what I'm looking at. Let's go and fill in an email address and complete this form. Okay, this is looking promising. Let's go over to the database, and in our reset password request table, you'll see that we now have one record relating to user ID 9. Let's have a look at our users, and that was me, Gary@example.com. So that's all good so far. The route it redirected me to was this one, app check email, and then it rendered this page here, check email.html.twig. Let's go and have a look at that. And so it's just a couple of paragraphs. It tells you that it sent you an email and to check your spam folder if you've not received it. Here's that email now. So it just tells you that in order to reset your password, you need to click that link, and it also reminds us that this will expire in 1 hour. So this is where that is all processed. Process sending password reset email. So it looks for a user with that email address, and a clever little thing here, a little security thing, is even if there is no email address matching, it will still send you to that route to tell you that an email has been sent to you. Next, a reset token or reset tokens are generated. A hashed token is stored on the password reset request, and a public token gets emailed to the user. And this is that email here. So new templated email. As you can see, the admin at security demo and the security name are used, gets sent to the user's email address, and the public token gets included. And you're redirected to the route which says to check your mail. So this is the link that it says here. If we look at the path, it's reset password, then reset, and then a token. And that's the public token which we get sent. So reset password, reset, and then token. Let's click on this and see how we get on. So it's taken us to a page with a couple of empty password boxes. So one is the password and one is the repeat password. I'll show you how this form is created shortly. Just click on that. It's taken us to login. So let's go and enter our new password in here and see if it's worked. Submit, and we're redirected to the home page. It looks like everything has worked. I'll show you email.html.twig, which you will find in templates, reset password, email, html.twig. So this is where the URL is created. As you can see, it's app reset password path with the token appended onto that. Let's take a look at the reset method of the reset password controller. As you can see, there's quite a lot going on here, but the bit we're interested in is this part here where the form is submitted. So checks if the form is submitted and if it's valid, and then there's really three main things which happen here. First off, it removes the request, the password reset request, from the database. Let me go and look at my database and see if that has happened. So I'll give that a refresh, and there you go, bang, it's gone. Great, so that's working so far. The next thing it does, it encodes the plain password which we've submitted. That then gets saved on our user entity and stored in the database with doctrine get manager flush. We clean the session after reset, and then we redirect to the home page. That's the route that we specified during the setup when we were asked the questions in the console. Let's have a quick look at the form. It looks like it should only have one field, but if we look at the change password form type, again, it looks like we're adding only one field, but if you look at the type of that field, it says it's a repeated type, and that itself takes a type, which is password type. So basically the same thing twice. And really it's just a usability thing to help the user or prevent the user from entering their password incorrectly. If you look at the access control key in our security YAML file, you'll see that we had this commented out path which began with admin. So let's use that now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new controller and a new route which will use paths beginning with admin. So I'm going to call this admin controller, and that will extend abstract controller. And then I'm just going to create a method and a route which will display a dashboard, an admin dashboard kind of thing. And so the route is going to be admin dashboard. So it means that the route begins with admin, which will match the path that we just showed in the security YAML file. And I'll also give it a name of admin_dashboard. Now I'm going to need a page to render, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to templates. I'm going to create a new folder in there called admin, and then inside of that I'll just create a twig file which I shall call dashboard.html.twig. I'm going to keep this really simple. It's just going to be a one line to show that you're on the right page. So I'll include the base file. As you can see, I'm getting some auto completion because I'm using the Symfony plugin for PHP Storm, and I'm just going to go and borrow some markup here. So we'll paste that in. Don't need this flash success, I can remove that, and then I'll just rename the heading to this is the admin dashboard so that we know that we're on the right page, and that's all I want to do. Back in admin controller, then I'm just going to return this I call render because I'm extending the abstract controller, and then admin dashboard.html.twig. Let's go over to our browser and visit that route. So it's redirected us to login, which means that we're not signed in. So let's sign in and give this another go. And that has redirected us to the home page because that's what happens when you sign in. So now let's again try and hit the admin dashboard. And so we get this angry access denied exception page, which is exactly what we need. It's basically saying we can't visit this page, it's forbidden because we don't have role admin, so it's working correctly. That, however, is how it displays in dev mode, but you don't want to show all that information to a user if you're in production. Instead, we show them only what they need to know. So in the .env file, you can find the app_env variable and change that to prod. Then we'll go back over, refresh, and as you can see, much less information, only what the user needs to know. Now that wasn't very pretty. You can style these yourself, so the page is written at the top of the screen, and here it has instructions on how you can create your own templates and show something a bit more custom to your own site. So let me change this back to dev. We'll go and refresh. As you can see, our exception is back. I'm going to log out. What I want to do is add myself as a role admin, and then we'll try it out again. But I'm going to do something particular. Instead of redirecting a logged in admin to the home page, I'm going to redirect a admin to the admin dashboard page once you log in. So you should know, or you should have an idea how to do this. In the login form authenticator, I'm going to add another option in the authentication success method. So I want to keep the first option as is. If you're trying to get to a certain path, then we'll keep it. We'll keep the target path in place so that when you log in, it sends you there if that was your intended location. But if there isn't a target path, then we'll check if the user is an admin. So there isn't actually a method on the user of isAdmin at the moment, but that's something that we'll create, and I get the user off of the token. So let's go over to the user and we'll create our isAdmin method. So I'll scroll down to the bottom, and all this is going to do is just check if the user is an admin and return a boolean true or false. So how am I going to perform this check? Well, if you recall, on the user we have this method getRoles. GetRoles returns an array of roles which the user has, and so all we need to do is check if role admin is in that array. It's as simple as that. So I'm just going to leave a little placeholder in here. I'm not going to actually hard code it in because I prefer to use constants for these kind of things, because it means if names change, you're only changing them in one place. So We'll just leave this as is for a second. We'll scroll up to the top. I'm going to create a constant called role admin, and the value of it will be a string of role admin. So now I can drop this in here, self role admin. And what I think I'll do is I'll just go and dump this out and see what value we're getting back before we try it out for real, and make sure that the code we've just written is actually working how we expect it to, and we're getting a boolean. So I'll try and log in, and it's giving me true. Okay, so if I change this to something else like role foo, then hopefully we should see false because I don't have role foo. Okay, perfect. Let's clean this up, and then we'll just go and let our requests run through all the way, and hopefully, yes, it takes us to the admin dashboard, so that's working perfectly. Let me now show you another way of achieving the same access control. So I'm going to comment out our admin path in the security YAML file, and I'm actually going to use annotations to check if the user has role admin, and I can actually do it at route level. So I'm just checking if the user has role admin so that they can access admin dashboard. I use the isGranted class from the framework extra bundle, and I pass in role admin, and I give it a refresh, and it works exactly the same as it did before. So let me try role foobar, and as you can see, that breaks it. The error message pretty good, tells you exactly how this has happened. Access denied by controller, annotation is granted. So see how the controller is called admin controller. That suggests that all the routes in this are going to begin with admin. What you can actually do, instead of protecting your methods, your routes, you can actually protect the entire controller. So you must have role admin to execute any methods in that controller. Give it a refresh, and as you can see, it works exactly the same. What I want to do now is show you something else. I'm going to need a nav bar in order to do that. So here I am at Bootstrap. I like the look at this one. We'll look at the page source, and we'll just take a couple of things from here. So we're going to need some styling. I'll bump this up so we can see it. What I'll do is I'll copy this, and I'll drop it underneath the style sheets block. Then back over to the browser, you'll see this little link here to navbar top fixed CSS file. Just click that, then grab this. I think this is for styling pages where the navbar gets fixed to the top. So probably not essential, but we'll take it anyway. Instead of div container for the main content, Bootstrap is using main class equals container. We might as well be consistent and just keep everything the same as Bootstrap. The next thing I'm going to do is grab the navbar, because this is going to be the main piece that we're looking at. And so I'm not going to need all of it. I'm just going to need one link really for what I want to demonstrate. So I'll remove all of this, and I'll rename this, and we'll just change it to dashboard. This is what's displayed on the navbar, as in like your brand. So I'm going to change that to security demo, and then I need to set the path to the dashboard. So if you're unfamiliar with Twig, we can do that with the path helper method, and we just pass in the name of the route. And what I want to do with this is see where it's displaying dashboard. I only want it to display that link if the user has role admin, and the way that I can do that is by using a is_granted function, which is available in Twig. And then, like we did in the admin controller, we pass in role admin. So go and check this out. I expect to see the link because I have the role admin, so the dashboard link is there. If I change this to a role that I don't have, for example role foo, refresh, and the dashboard link is gone because I don't have role foo. Great stuff. Back in security YAML, I want to address something. I don't really like having to use this negative here. There must be a better way of doing it than that, and in fact there is. There is a role called is authenticated anonymously, which is perfect for routes where you don't want the user to be authenticated, or you don't want the user to have role user. So let's log out. That's redirected me to login page, and it's allowed me to visit there anonymously, so it means this must be working. The other ones were reset password, that works, and register. Okay, great, so we've been able to visit all those anonymously. But now I've lost my protection on my other pages, so if I try and visit home page, it lets me, but I don't have a authenticated user to get a username attribute off. I'll switch this back to the login page and we'll go back to security YAML, and I'll show you how we do this now. So underneath this first check, so this is checking to make sure that the user is authenticated anonymously, and then if I want to visit any other route, so I can just put a single slash, then in those scenarios I need to be authenticated. So we can use role user like we've done before, or we can use some of the other options which are available to us. Probably the most common one is authenticated fully, and there are different sort of variations of this is authenticated fully, which I'll show you shortly. But first off, let's check that this is working. We'll try and log in. Perfect, we're logged in. So the way this works, it just goes down the list. First it'll check this, and then it'll check this. So the first one checks if the path matches login, register or reset password, and the user is authenticated anonymously. If both those conditions ain't met, it moves on to the next one, and both the conditions have to be met, and then what will happen is it'll stop. Authorization is granted and you're directed to whatever path you're trying to get to. If however none of the matches are evaluated to true, then an access denied exception is thrown. Authorization has failed. Here is where you can read some more about is authenticated fully. It tells you how this works, but it also tells you about some of the other roles which are similar, such as is authenticated remembered, and this means you're logged in because of a remember me cookie. You'll also see down here the is authenticated anonymously, and so basically all users, even authenticated ones, have is authenticated anonymously, but it's useful for scenarios like we tried where we need to visit pages and you are not authenticated. Before I move on, I just want to add a link on my login page to the register page, because currently you can only log in, but there's nothing to help you if you're not actually registered. So let's go over to login.html.twig, and this is the header which says please sign in. I'll borrow a link from here, paste that in there, and then we just need to customize this as a register route. So register, and then we're using the path function here, and I just need to change this to the name of the register route, which is app register. Refresh, and that's perfect. Okay, great stuff. For this final demonstration, I'm going to talk about role hierarchy, and what that means is if you have a particular role, you get automatically granted other roles which fall within that role's hierarchy. So it sounds a bit technical. Let me show you this. It's going to be really simple. First off, need to create a new controller to demonstrate this, so I'm creating one called accounts controller. Just going to have an index method, and I'm also going to create an accompanying twig file which we can render from this index method, and inside of templates accounts I've called it index.html.twig. I'll include base.html.twig, and just going to change this to something where we can recognize that this is the accounts page. Okay, so let's render that page. And I'm not getting any auto completion there because I've not actually extended the abstract controller. So let's do that, and that means that I can call this render, and then all we need is the file path and name. And then I'm just going to add my routing. So this is going to be like an overview page of accounts. So in fact, we'll call it that. Route accounts /overview. And then for the name, we'll call it accounts_overview. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this controller only accessible to users who have role bookkeeper. So the same as what we did with our admin controller, I'm going to add is granted to the whole of the controller. So let's grab the route and go and test this out. So hopefully first time, because I'm not signed in. Good, it redirects me to the login page. Now it should be saved as a target path. It's redirected me there, but we have an access denied exception because I don't have the bookkeeper role. So I'm not going to give myself the bookkeeper role. What I'm going to do is in the security.yaml file underneath the security key, I'm going to add another key called role hierarchy. And so what I can do here is I specify role admin, and then underneath this I can add an array of all the roles which a role admin also has as part of the hierarchy. So a simple explanation: if you have the role admin, that means you get automatically granted role bookkeeper and any other roles in that array, in fact. And so when I refresh, as you can see, it's given me access. Let's start off by creating an account entity, and this is going to be our subject. So we're going to try and perform actions such as show, delete, and depending on who we are, we may or may not be allowed to perform those actions. So Symfony console make :entity account, and that opens up the maker prompts. So we're going to add a field called balance. That will be of type float. It will be not nullable. Then we'll add another property, and we're going to call this account holder, and this will have a many-to-one relationship with the user entity. So the class it relates to is user. The account hold property cannot be nullable because the account needs to have an account holder. Do you want to add a new property to user so that you can access account? I'll put no for that, I won't need that. Okay, let's add another property, and this is going to be account manager. And so this will have a one-to-one relationship with the user. So one account manager to one account. That relates to user. Account manager can't be null, and I don't want to add anything to the user entity. And so that will do us. We are good. Let's go and take a look at our account entity. Hopefully there won't be any surprises in there. So here's our properties, and here's the relationship. So that means many accounts to one user. If you need any help with doctrine relations and entities, then check out my doctrine relations series where I explain all that stuff, all the different kind of one-to-one, many-to-one, etc. I'll put a link at the top of the screen for that for you. Our entity looks good, so let's make our migration, which I can do with Symfony console make :migration. It's telling me that the migration has been made, so let's go and check that out, which is in the migrations folder. And here we go. So I'll clean this one up a little bit to make it easier for us to read. And as you can see, 4 properties: ID, account holder ID, account manager ID, and balance. So you notice it's using integer IDs to relate to our user entity table. Let's migrate it with Symfony console doctrine :migrations migrate. And then over to the database. So here's our migrated table. In order to demonstrate what I want to demonstrate, I'm just going to create an extra user in the database who will act as an account manager for the account record that I'm going to create. So just make up any email address, password, then register. And so we've created our new user. Let's go and have a look. So in the database now we have 3 users. 1 who has the role admin, and 2 which don't have any roles, but 1 will act as the account holder and 1 will act as the account manager. So that's our role admin. This second one, which is ID 10, will act as the account holder, and ID 11 will act as the account manager. So let's go and create that account. We'll give it an ID of 1. The account holder is going to be ID 10. The account manager ID will be 11, and we'll just put in a nominal balance of 1,000. Save that. That record has now been created. Now what I want to do is create a method where I can show the account, and then you'll be able to view the account if you have certain permissions. If you recall, we protected the whole controller with this bookmaker is granted annotation. I'm just going to move that onto the index method, and so that's not going to block us. And then we'll create our show method. And so basically, if you're the account holder or if you're the account manager, you'll be able to see this account, but if you're neither of those people, then you won't be able to. So I'll dump out the account and then I'll add some routing, and for this I'm going to use param binding, so the ID portion of this URL will map to the ID of the account which is being injected into the show method, and I do that using curly braces. I'll make sure that the only method which can be used on this endpoint is a get. So I have a methods argument which takes an array, and inside there I put in the allowed methods. And then just to be clear on the param binding, the ID which you see here will map to the account which is getting passed in to the method. There are no restrictions set up just yet, so we should be able to visit this and see our account dumped out in the browser, and sure enough we do. So here's our entity, account entity. As you can see, we've got all the account manager details because that is the actual logged in user. The account holder, it just has like a placeholder proxy. It's a doctrine thing and it's used for lazy loading, and the only property on that, as you can see, is the ID. Now let me try and explain how permissions works in Symfony. I'll give this my best shot. So we check if something is granted an attribute. That can be a role, a permission, or a authentication check such as is authenticated fully. And then the way this works is that the attribute is tested by a voter or something called a voter, and if it passes that vote check by the voter, then the permission is granted. Any attributes which start with role underscore, like role admin, get checked by the role voter, which is a special voter that checks the user's roles against the attributes which are being tested. So let's dump out the user's roles. And as you can see, we have an array with one role, which is role user. And now let's dump out the attributes. And as you can see, we have the same thing. We have an array of attributes with just the one, which is a role user. So this should be a match. Let's just have a little reminder of where this role user comes from for the user. So when we call get roles, we automatically add the role user to the array of roles which comes back. Voters have their own unique way of checking if a certain permission is granted, and the way that the role voter works is it loops through the attributes, loops through the roles, and just checks if they are a match, and if so, access is granted. So that one's fairly straightforward and easy to understand. We can create our own custom voters, and that's what we're going to need to do in order to check if a user is allowed to view a account. So as you can see, the isGranted method takes two arguments. The second one is optional, and that will be the subject. So the first one will be our attribute, and we're going to call this show. You can call it anything, but show is a good name because that's what we're checking what the user can do. And then the second argument will be the account. So we're going to see if the user is granted to show the account. Fairly straightforward so far, I hope. What I'm going to do in order to keep the conditionals to a minimum inside of my control method is move the check into an annotation just above the method. So it's pretty much exactly the same. I'm using the isGranted annotation, and the first argument will be the attribute and the second argument will be the subject. And just note that I'm using a string here which matches the account argument like so. And then what we'll do is we'll go and try this out. Now at the moment we don't have a voter which handles a show attribute, and in such circumstances, as you can see here, access is denied because in such circumstances the default is that access would not be granted. In other words, the isGranted check evaluates to false. Let's create a voter, and we do this with Symfony console make : voter. So this will make it for us. Of course, you could just go and write the code yourself. We're going to call it account voter, and that's all we need to do. Let's go and check out our new account voter. So this first method supports, it takes the two arguments, attribute and subject, and basically this works like our login form authenticator supports method. It's checking to see if this voter is needed. And so it'll look and see if the attribute matches one of the values in this array, and also if the subject is an instance of app entity account. And so if this returns true, then yes, this voter is going to be needed, and then it moves on to the next method, which is vote on attribute. And this is where we write our custom code to see if permission is granted. So we have access to a few things. Obviously, we've got the attribute, we have the subject. We can get the user off of the token using token get user. The auto-generated code is suggesting that we use a switch block to perform our checks. I have other ideas, but we'll go with it for now. And so what I'm just going to do is, for the case of show, I'm just going to return false for now. And that should still show our access denied exception message. So let's go back over to the browser. In fact, we'll change this to account so that if it does get through, we show the account. Refresh. Okay, access is still denied. Now, let's change this to true, and we should see our account getting dumped out. And there you go. So we know that that's working. Now we could just apply our own logic and make it work the way we want it to. I'm using PHP 8 and I don't particularly like switch blocks. I think they're really ugly. So what I'm going to do is use a match expression. So if you've not used these yet and you are using PHP 8, it's your lucky day. This is going to be pretty cool. We're going to reduce all that mess to just a couple of lines of code. And the way it works is that we return the result of the match expression. We'll stick with just using booleans for now, and then we'll make it a bit more complex as we go along. So I'm just going to dump out the access is granted variable and see what we get. So we should match show, and in which case we'll get true. So refresh, true. Let's change this to false. Refresh, false. Okay, that's working. So now what we need to do is decide what our rules are for deciding on whether we can show the account to the user who is asking. The way I'm going to do this is check if the authenticator user is the account holder or if the authenticator user is the account manager. I'm just renaming the subject argument to account just to make this clear. And so let's perform our checks. So account. I think some auto-completion would serve as well here. So I'll add a dot block and I'll make this an account. And then account, get account holder. And then I'll check if that is the user, which we're getting off the token, or account, get account manager, and same again, I'm seeing if the account manager is the authenticated user or vice versa, and this should return us a boolean. Let's go over to the browser and have a look. And so we get true for that. I'm logged in as the account manager, so if I remove account manager from this check, I should get false, which I do. Everything's working well, and so all we have to do is return the result of this method. Now, you might sometimes be tempted to do something like this where you just directly return the expression. I'm not really keen on those things, because if someone's reading this for the first time and they're not sure about match expressions, it might not be instantly obvious. Whereas if you're returning a variable saying access is granted, which is a result of an expression, then any other developer can read this and have a pretty good idea of what's going on straight away. So try and be explicit, keep your code fairly clear and easy for others to read. Okay, with that bit of life advice out of the way, let's go and render a page which we can show. I'm going to pass in the account, and then what we'll need to do is create a template. So over in templates and in accounts, we'll just call it show.html.twig. And we'll create something really simple initially, just to check that it's working, which will be a page that shows maybe the account number. In fact, yes, we'll do that. So just one heading and the account, and the way that we access the account is in the double curly braces, and then we can get the ID by doing .id. So in here we just put in the name of our template, and then we can run it in the browser, and as you can see that's working and we have access because at this moment in time we are the account manager. Let's add a couple of list items, and one will be the account holder name or username, and the other one will be the account manager's username. So curly braces, account.accountmanager.username, and that's how we access the account manager's username. And I think what I'll also have is a link where I can delete the account, and under the delete attribute in our voter, we'll add some special logic in there to do that, a special rule in order to be able to delete an account. So I'll give this a path name of delete account, and we're going to need to pass in the ID. The way we do that in Twig is like this. So ID : account.id, and that will give us the account ID that we're going to delete as a URL parameter. So like our show method where we're using the ID, we're binding the ID which will map to the account. We're doing exactly the same thing with delete here. So the method will take an account, and then the routing fairly similar to the show method, except we're going to call it accounts, and then we have the ID in the curly braces and then delete, and we need to give it the name. So the name that we used in our Twig file was delete account, and we're going to specify that the method is get. And so here we're going to have our is granted, and the attribute is of course delete, and then the subject is account, so exactly the same as we did for our show method there. And from this one, all I'm going to do is just return a response with a message that says that the account has been deleted. So a response comes from HTTP Foundation, and I'm just saying deleting account, and then we'll add the account ID. So if we now go back to our account voter, let's figure out what we're going to do here. What I really want to do, because deleting an account is probably quite a big thing, let's say that this can only be performed by admins only. How do you suppose we do this? We need to check if the user is an admin. So we can actually access the security component in other services just by injecting it into the constructor. I'm using PHP 8, so I'm going to use property promotion. So with one line of code, I now have injected the security component. Let's dump it out and just make sure that this is working first before we try and do anything with it. Refresh. Okay, so Symfony component security core security. That's what we're looking for. Let's now use this on our delete attribute. So of course we can call is granted on security, and then the attribute for that will be role admin, meaning that the role voter will get called behind the scenes. Let's go and test this out in the browser. So refresh, then we just need to click the delete. Access denied. Perfect. So just what we were expecting, the only person who can delete an account is an admin. So just before we sign in as an admin, I think it'll be a good idea to also allow an admin to show an account. Now, as you can see, this is becoming quite unwieldy. So what we'll do is we'll strip that out and we'll replace it with a show method, which we'll add underneath this. It's going to need to take the account and the user. So we'll pass those in as args, and we'll go away and create that now. So fairly straightforward. We'll just make this a private function. Don't need access to it outside of this voter. Show account user, and then we're returning what we were originally going to do from the match expression, but we're also going to add on a check to see if the user has the admin role. So exactly the same as what we're using on the delete attribute. This security is granted role admin. Okay, and that should be good for us. We'll just indicate that this should return a boolean. And I think we're ready to test it out. So let's go over to the browser. First off, we'll log out because we need to log back in as a admin. So log out, and then our admin is this one here, Gary@example.com. And we'll move over to look at our account, and we should get access because we are an admin. Okay, so far so good. Let's delete this. Perfect. Deleting accounting 1. So 2 voter checks passed there, 1 for show and 1 for delete. The first thing I'm going to do is install Symfony Test Pack, which, because I'm using Flex, I can just say compose that require PHP unit, and that'll install a load of other dependencies including PHP unit bridge, DOM crawler and browser kit. Now I'm going to create a test called Authorization test. And so we're just going to test some of the things which we did in the last recording regarding authorization and some of the permissions to be able to perform certain actions. If you recall, we created an account, and we also have some users who are sort of stakeholders in that account. You have the account holder, the account manager, and I've added one other user who has absolutely nothing to do with that account, and so they shouldn't be able to perform any actions on it. Hopefully you will have noticed that my test is extending web test case. That comes from Symfony bundle, framework bundle, test, web test case. And we use web test case if we want to test endpoints. So for feature tests, things like that, or functional tests, depending on what you prefer to call them. First thing I'm going to do is just test that this is working. And when we actually run this, it will pull in PHP unit, because we don't have that yet. It needs to check first if we have it or not. If we don't, it'll then add that dependency, and then at the end of that run the test. So that passes, that's green. Now let's do a little bit of setup so that we can work on our authorization test. Web test case gives us a lot of handy stuff, and one of those things is a client simulator called kernel browser. And so I'm going to get that by calling static create client, and I'll save that on a client property on the class. And then in order to test authorization, we're obviously going to need a user, so I'll also get a user repository. And what we're going to do is we're just going to use our development database and query that to get hold of users. In a larger application, I'd probably set up a test database, but we won't need it here because this is mainly for demonstration purposes. So now we have a client and we have a user repository. Let's write our first test. This first test is an admin can visit the admin dashboard. So we're just checking that any user with role admin is able to visit the admin dashboard. Minimum setup for this one, we just need a user and we need to log the user in. So I'll show you how to do that in a sec. First off, we'll query the database, and we need to query for a user who has a role admin. I'm going to use some of Doctrine's built-in magic. If I append the name of the property onto the end of the find one by method, then it will find you one record using that property. So find one by email in our case. Then we need to simulate logging the user in, and we can do that by using the login user method on the client. So Symfony is really good for testing. It has all these handy things like that. The action we need to perform is to attempt visiting the admin dashboard. So we can call the request method on the client. It's a get request, and this is the endpoint we're after, admin dashboard. And then we just need to make an assertion based on what we've just attempted to do. And there's a handy little method called assert response is successful. One test, one assertion, that passes. Let's now grab the email of a user who is not an admin, and we'll try again. So it gives you all that stuff, but ultimately it says that the test has failed. So that's good. Now let's have a look at some of the other tests we're going to cover. First off, we're going to test that user cannot view another's account. Then an account holder can view their own account. An account manager can view accounts which they manage. A non-admin cannot delete an account, that should say. We'll fix that shortly. And an admin can delete an account. A lot of the time I will set my tests up like this because it just gives you a bit of a roadmap, and it gives you that focus. You know exactly what you need to accomplish, so you spend less time wondering what you need to do next. First thing we need to test is that a user cannot view another user's account. So I'll copy some of the code from the previous test, which we can customize, and we'll just check who are the stakeholders in the account. And so what I'll do is I'll use my stooge, which has no connection to any accounts, paste that email address in there. Then we need to change the URL. So I'll grab that from accounts controller, paste that in there, and it's accounts and the number is 1. And this time I'm going to check that the response is a 403 status, which means unauthorized, forbidden. And then if we get that back, it means the test has passed. Run this. Okay, perfect. One test, one assertion. Now let's copy that and we'll move on to our next test, which is an account holder can view their own account. 3 things that we need to do to this test. First, we need to annotate it as a test, and then instead of asserting that response status code is 403, we're just going to assert that it's a successful response. And then just behind the scenes, I've also pasted in the email address of the account holder, which is another user at example.com. And so let's go and run this. And we get a green test. Perfect. Let's now copy this, and we are going to test that an account manager can view accounts which they manage. So it'll be the same account number. As you can see, our account manager email address is accmanager@example.com. We just need to run that test again. And so that's working. Copy again. So you can go through this really quickly if you're focused and you've set up your tests in a logical order. You can really rip through them. Now we're going to test that a non-admin cannot delete an account. So we'll take our stooge again, paste that email address in there, and this time we want a 403 response. So I'll grab the URL, which is accounts/id/delete. For this one, again, we're back to asserting that the response is a 403 status. So paste that in there, and then we just need to go and run the test. And that's green. And so we're left with just one test, and that is that an admin can delete an account. Same again, copy and paste. Annotate that it's a test. And this time we want a successful response. So I'll just grab the email address of the admin. I'll change this last line. Then run the test. And so we have a series of green tests. And just to clarify something, we didn't actually delete an account there. I'll show you why. If you recall, in the controller, we don't actually delete an account. We just send back a response to say that an account is being deleted, but no database delete queries are being executed. And so that, my friend, concludes the series on Symfony 5 security. Congratulations on working all the way to the end. It's a fantastic achievement. Hopefully you know a lot more than you did at the start, and that you can put it to use in your projects. If you have gained value from these lessons, then please give me a thumbs up, and don't hesitate to share if you want to help other developers like yourself. And one last thing, if you want YouTube to show you more of my content, all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon. I release new material every few days. Details of my schedule can be found on the community tab of my YouTube channel homepage.